Things are going really well right now. The stock market's at all-time highs, there are jobs everywhere, and we've finally tamed the beasts of inflation. Yet no one seems happy about it, especially those born around 2010, known as Gen Z, and they're taking to TikTok to let us know exactly what's wrong. Here's a viral video against the draining 9 to 5.
I know I'm probably just being so dramatic and annoying, but this is my first job, like my first 9 to 5 job after college, and I'm in person, and I'm commuting in the city, and it takes me forever to get there, and then like I don't have time to do anything. I want to shower, eat my dinner, and go to sleep.
And here's another one about out of control rent prices.
Why is it that I have to work 40 hours a week just so I can have a place to live? 40 hours a week makes me $2,000 a month, and my rent is $1,660.
Now, as a Gen X, I'm not here to get all okay boomer on y'all, which is why I brought in an incredible expert, KYLA Scanlon. KYLA is one of the most thoughtful people out there covering the intersection of economics, technology, and culture. She's a regular on the New York Times, Bloomberg, and all the major publications, not to mention her massive TikTok following. We discussed the disconnect about how things are going in the economy and how people feel about it. The nonstop, in-your-face monetization of everything, that means you influencers, and how social media has led us to deeply crave third spaces. Now, before we jump into this video, if you're a hard-charging, ambitious professional looking to make a career change and leave a high-paying job, we have a group coaching program for you. You'll be joined by a group of post-achievement professionals looking to rethink their careers and reimagine their relationship with money. Just check out radreads.co/coaching. Now, on to my interview with KYLA Scanlon. I hope you enjoy.
I thought I would start with this viral TikTok video about a woman lamenting the 9 to 5 job. I suspect most people have not seen this video listening to this. So if you recall that video and some of the associated commentary, and that could kick us off.
Yeah. So it was, I think she had just started her first job, and she was talking about, she didn't hate her job, but she hated the 9 to 5, like the structure of the job, because she didn't feel like there was a world outside of that. Like, you know, she commuted, she worked, she commuted, and there wasn't really a lot of free time. And so she made this TikTok video talking about that. And of course, all these people were like, well, she just doesn't understand hard work. And she's going to have to wake up one day and realize that the world is hard and things suck. And I wrote this response piece to it, you know, talking about how we should probably wish for a better future, and that the 9 to 5 is essentially a relic from the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of jobs don't require that working framework. It actually goes against a lot of people's chronotypes. Like when they work best is not necessarily 9 to 5. It might be morning, like 4 a.m. to, I don't know, however many 8 hours would be, or maybe it's not even 8 hours of straight work. And so the whole piece was just sort of talking about the way that we think about work can change. And like, that should be something that we think about exploring, especially as we develop new technology that enables us to like have, video podcast recordings and interact with each other via technology. We should think about how we can leverage that into changing our work style as well.
So I was fascinated by that because I think I saw one of your tweets where it's like the older generation, it's just human nature. It's like older generation shits on younger generation. And so I don't even remember. It's like I'm Gen X. No one talks about Gen X. We're like forgotten in the conversation of generations. So that's, I'll go with that separately. But I do, as a Gen X who works and interacts with a lot of millennials and Gen Zs, I feel like there's this kind of constant narrative. Like if you look at kind of the main comments to that video, it's like, this is what hard work looks like. You're going to have to suffer. Grow up, kid. You're so entitled, And I just don't believe that to be true about younger generations. How do you, I know that you kind of speak in the opposite direction to older, boomers and Gen X's with, different economic topics that you cover. How do you reconcile this kind of intergenerational warfare of sorts?
Yeah. I mean, like, why do I think it's happening?
Yeah. Why do you think it's happening? Are there kernels of truth to it? What are people completely missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason that it's happening is because of technology. Like a lot of the older generation doesn't understand aspects of social media, doesn't understand aspects of, why people would want to work from home rather than going into the office. There's this New York Times piece that talked about how boomers got most of their social life and therefore most of their validation from going into the office. That's where all their buddies were. That's where they would, talk and hang out. And for younger generations, they just think about that structure a little bit differently. And especially because the promise of work has changed. I wrote this piece with Fast Company kind of talking about that. You don't really work for the same company for 40 years. And there are all these alternative career paths that you can go on, like making videos about the economy and things like that. So I think that the older generation doesn't quite understand that shift in career path, and then doesn't understand the shift in the desire of a change in working style. And I hesitate to call it generational warfare because I think that there are groups within each that kind of understand each other. There's boomers that aren't so resistant to the idea of change. But I think, for Gen Z, they sort of look at the older generations, and there's an incredible amount of wealth trapped in the older generations. And of course, you could argue that they deserve that. Like, they've worked really hard, they've been on Earth way longer. Therefore, that's just how it is. But I do think there's a lot of difficulty with the beginner mode, like getting your foot on that ladder. It's hard for the younger generation in a lot of ways, whether that be because of the housing crisis, childcare crisis makes it difficult to have children for some people. And I just think that it just feels like resources are not maybe as equitably distributed as people would like. And that does come down to age group differences.
Yeah. Do you think this question about kind of beginner mode feels harder? Is there a way, if you put your economist hat on, is there a way to kind of evaluate, like comparatively evaluate beginner mode across different like time period cohorts? And as you said, like the ones that are glaring, right? Housing prices, childcare costs. I would presume you would also throw in education costs and costs of college debt. As an economist and someone who studies the economy, are there kind of point in time comparisons across that to substantiate or to like demonstrate that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of comparisons that will compare millennials now to where boomers were at the same age. And millennials are catching up, which is great. But for a long time, boomers were ahead at the same age that millennials are. They had more wealth, they had a house usually, had more stability in a lot of ways. So in like, you can look at other data points, and like there was a piece from I think the Financial Times showing how many more people are living with their parents versus living
I saw
alone.
that.
And that might not be a bad thing, right? Like, it's not a bad thing to stick around, but it does mean that you're starting your life later. So I think that's kind of the big thing, is that people are putting off these big life decisions later and later in life.
Yeah.
And normally you would kind of start your life right away, but because it's more expensive to do so, you have to find alternative paths.
Yeah. Do you think that in terms of the opportunities that are available, so if I like put my college graduating hat on, it was like, oh well, so many of the traditional industries are still available, still hiring, Wall Street, medicine, law, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's this whole other, like when I graduated college in 2001, like you went to work. If you wanted to work at tech, it was big tech. It was Microsoft or Sun Microsystems, right? And maybe Oracle. And then kind of this whole kind of internet economy in addition to all that. Is there, like, if you look at the opportunity, so we've discussed like kind of the cost structure makes beginner mode hard. Has the opportunity set grown to match the cost structure, shrunk? Like, is there some kind of is there a way to look at them one in respect to the other?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that, yeah, there's more college educated people. People are able to get jobs in industries that never existed, similar to like 2001, right? Like, there's always new industries being created, always old jobs being destroyed. So potentially, yeah, there are different opportunities. I would say that a lot of people would argue that um, uh, wealth inequality has increased, which so like a wage that is a beginner wage doesn't take you as far as it used to. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty. There's like the problem with everything all of the time is that like there's good and bad that comes with
Yeah.
it. And it's not a question of like if the bad overshadows the good. It's just like, do they exist alongside of each other? And so, yes, there are opportunities that have grown out of this, and companies that have flourished, and people who have made, you know, like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year product managing at Google. So there's opportunity, but I think the big worry is that the opportunity is not equally distributed.
Do you see on the issue of housing? So we have young kids. I make a good living and invest reasonably, and so my wife and I have already spoken about we've already had the conversation. They're like, at some point there's going to be money left over, and like we don't really think about like leaving our kids an inheritance or like whatever. Like I'm more of the die with zero philosophy in that regards. But we're like, we would love to help them buy their first home. And so, I mean, my kids are 10 and 8, right? So that's a decision that we're already like entertaining, mentally. That's 20 years, 15 to 25 years from now. Is there, I mean, I know this, right? There's an entire podcast based on this question, but like in this question of housing, what's the way out for younger, besides like parents helping kids buy their first homes?
I mean, that's kind of the path that a lot of parents are taking, and it's great if you're able to provide that to your kids. But it goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier with the bifurcation. Like a lot of parents can't afford that, and therefore their kid does kind of get left behind a certain amount. And so like, the housing crisis at large is an issue of supply. So there's just not enough homes for the people that want the homes, especially in cities that people want to live in. So it's really a question of like, how do we redesign policy and redesign zoning to make it so homes can be built? I was riding my bike yesterday, and I was we were on this bike path, and I was looking at all the different apartment buildings, and they're like so stark, and this is a tangent, but like they're so stark and square and boring to look at. I do think like we owe it to ourselves to build more beautiful housing. As we build housing, I think that would be creatively quite inspiring for people to live in something that's beautiful. But yeah, I think the housing crisis is an issue of supply and demand. And then there's, of course, like boomers just kind of rattling around and, 4-bedroom homes where that might be time for a millennial who wants to have kids to move in, but the boomers are holding on to it because why wouldn't they? They're able to lock in a really low mortgage rate. Mortgage rates are sky high right now, 6.5%, 7%. And so you kind of have these two groups. You have the people who are able to get into a house pre-pandemic, sort of lock in that golden 2%. And then you have people who were not able to, and therefore it's more difficult to finance a home. And then you have the people who are going to inherit some sort of wealth, some sort of asset from their parents. And then you have those who aren't. And that gets into the question of inheritance tax, which is quite unpopular, but yeah.
You had mentioned kind of social media. You're talking about kind of the return to the office. It's funny. I was talking to someone on Wall Street yesterday. And I said, "So, are you telling me basically like the 5-day in the office is back in Midtown New York?" He's like, "Totally back." I was like, "Wow!" And to me, I used to work in that regime, and I'm like, "Guys, we had an opportunity. We had like the best shot that we're gonna have to kind of try something new." And what are we, three years out of the pandemic? It's like, yep, just back to the way it was. But you had made a comment about kind of the role. You said in the past people would make the majority of their friendships in the office, and now it's all over. It's all in social media. And so I'd love for you to like, what are the like not obvious ways that social media kind of permeates into, I don't know, like you can to pick a topic like work, or maybe the economy is like too broadly, but you said you've been studying different effects of social media, and I'd love to kind of your take on like what are the like second, third order effects of generations building entire social lives off of social media.
It's bad. It's bad.
It's bad.
Yeah,
Oh, I thought you're like, my question's bad. I'm like, that's too
no,
big of a question.
no. No, it's not a bad question. No, I think the social media has created a lot of issues for people. Like, I think there's a lot of value in building community online. Like, I have made a whole career by just being
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
But I think there's this book called Present Shock by Douglas Rushkoff, and it was written in 2010-ish, and he kind of knew what was going to happen, I think. But he talks about like how disorienting it is to be online and to like be talking at a computer screen and sort of not like I think it's like 95% of our language is conveyed through body language. And so
Really?
when we're talking to each other via text, when we're talking to each other via video, you miss out on a lot of the human experience. And so I think that's like a large part of the cognitive dissonance that we're seeing, where it's like, well, you know, I have these dopamine hits from people retweeting my tweet or liking my Instagram post, but I feel empty. And of course, like I'm biased because like my life is social media. So like I might feel that a little bit more viscerally and align to that a little bit more than somebody who isn't online would align to it. But I do think largely when you talk to people who use social media, they will talk about some sort of feeling of isolationism or feeling like they're a little bit disconnected or feeling like they're being sucked in by the negativity. So I think social media is an incredible tool. But as we were talking about a little bit earlier, there's good and bad with everything.
Yeah.
And I think the bad of social media is the fact that we really like kind of need to be around each other. And I don't know if that means going into the office. I think it means third places, like just sort of being around each other and being creative. Like I think going back into the office is more of a control tactic because you'll still kind of be isolated in your cubicle, right? But I do think that like the more that we can be around each other from like that third place perspective, so like libraries and coffee shops, that's sort of where the community value comes in, because we're missing out on that in a large way right now with social media. Like it's not great for our brains. Yeah.
And is that obviously that kind of COVID
Yeah.
exacerbated that? Do you see kind of in your peer group or in kind of younger adults, young adults who are younger, not young adults, do you see like, because again, this is where like I'm 40, I'm almost 45, so I'll state my age, but there's, you know, like a kind of the retroness of, you know, bookstores are back in vogue and like, you know, people buying vinyl. Like my daughter wanted to buy, my 10-year-old was like, can I get a record player and buy
That's cool.
Kendrick Lamar's, you know, Good Kid, Mad City? Her older cousin had it. Like, is there some version of that as it relates to social interaction, as it relates to social, you know, the rebellion against, or, you know, the nostalgia against, you know, with respect to social media occurring right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think people are very tired of the influencer marketing. Like we're selling the lives and the skins of like these people. And I think people are starting to realize that that is not always authentic. And so there's this craving for authenticity. There's a craving for trust. And so people are really desiring to be defluenced. Like there's this video on TikTok of a guy who was like obsessed with vacuum cleaners. Like that was like his whole thing. Like, you know, people get into trains, like he was a vacuum cleaner guy. And he was just like, this is the absolute best vacuum cleaner that you can buy for your money. And it was like a $70 vacuum cleaner. And it got like 4 million likes. People were like, yes, I just want the straight facts. And I think the reason that bookstores are coming into vogue and like record players, like the sound on a record player is unlike anything that you'll ever experience. Like it is incredible, right? And it's designed to be incredible. Right now we have products and technology that for just the purposes of the companies, there is planned obsolescence. Like Apple's business model relies on you buying a new iPhone, and there's nothing wrong about that. It's just the business. And so people are looking at these products though that don't have the planned obsolescence aspect, and they're meant to last a long time, and they're meant to be really good. And I think there's kind of that craving for something that isn't going to just disappear. Like people want real things. And so I think that's sort of like what we're seeing with some parts of social media and the way that people are consuming it, is there's a desire to have things that are real. Yeah.
Do you think that, because being older, like the coming of age of the influencer to me feels like heavy Instagram, like kind of before videos, like Kardashian style. And then that has kind of morphed, but like that style has kind of moved over to more of the like TikTok. I'm on it, but I don't really get it.
That's good.
But more, it just feels more, it feels more real. And whether it's more real, it feels more real than a Kardashian, but I mean, that's like, what is that?
They're plastic.
What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And do you see that even, I guess, with the vacuum cleaner? Is that like, how do you see this kind of concept of influencers? Because whether you like the word or not, like you and I are a version of influencers in that we have platforms, we speak, and the things we say have downstream influence on people. I hate the term. I suspect you probably don't like the term either. I guess how do you see the evolution of the kind of influencer landscape? Because and let me just add to that. On the flip side, I'm sure you've seen all the studies. There's like all the statistics, like 50% of kids between the age of 12 and 18 want to be YouTubers, want to be TikTok influencers, and so on. So, how do you see that collision?
Yeah, there's I don't like that term either. But
Yes.
yeah, I've been called a finfluencer before, and I was like, okay, yikes. But it's true. There's an element of hypocrisy to what I'm saying, and that goes back to the point about good and bad. Like social media can be good, I think, especially if you're learning or using it to learn, which is what I try to do with my content. But I think like the direction of the influencers, it's still going to exist. Like there's still going to be an element of authenticity. But I think there is almost an influencer apocalypse happening where you have people like Alex Earl, who's great. Like she seems great. This is not a call on her person, but people have realized that she's like not a reality that they exist in. And so I think people are just going to seek out those that they align with. And part of the issue with content in general is that people have to make it. And so I don't know what the influencer marketing world will look like. I just know that people are trying to figure out how to position products differently. And, the Michael Cera CeraVe campaign is kind of an example of like what brands are trying to do. So they hired the celebrity Michael Cera, who's from Superbad, I think, that movie.
Okay.
He's like this goofy millennial dude who millennials love, and they just have all these pictures of him carrying around CeraVe bottles around Los Angeles,
Those
which
are
is the type of
like
lotion.
moisturizer?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's actually I use it actually. It's very good.
I use it too.
Yeah, it's very good product. But the advertising campaign is just him carrying the bottles. It's not anything about the effectiveness of it as a lotion. Like there's nothing about the actual product success. It's just this like guerrilla warfare style campaign of Michael Cera carrying around like 50 bottles in a bag around the streets, and then also signing CeraVe bottles inside the grocery store. And so they employed these influencers to like hype up the campaign and be like, oh my God, this is so weird. Like what's Michael Cera doing selling CeraVe? And so that's kind of like what we're seeing with the shift in marketing. I don't know if it's necessarily influencers. It's like if they're not selling the product, they're selling the story. And the weirder that you can make the story, like the more successful the campaign is going to be. Like the more shock value that you can have behind whatever you're trying to do matters. There's this quote from Liquid Death, which is that canned water, where everyone's like, why would I ever drink water in a can? But it's like a very successful product. And what he said is our competition is not other brands in the category. It's other things that you see in your social feed. That's our competition. And so now like the advertising of the influencer world, the advertising of everything is everywhere all at once, right? Like we're experiencing the past, the present, and the future all at the same time. And so I think influencer marketing is going to have to figure that out too. And I don't know what that will look like. I know that I kind of went off on a couple of tangents there, but it just goes to show like how confusing it is, because like these are real people. And like, do we always need to be marketed to? And like, how tired are people going to be of being marketed to constantly, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's so many. I think about the marketing thing because as someone who creates content, at the back, similar to you, for me, it's less about education, more about provocation, like getting people to think about things. That being said, I make money. I do coaching. I have so like there is an ask somewhere in the feed of content. I try to make it respectful, aligned, and so on. But at the end of the day, there's still an ask, and it just, it almost feels to me like if I go to any social media feed, it's just like, oh my God, it's just whether it's a company or a person, it's like someone wants me to buy shit. Like it's just, and it almost like stop. I had to stop. I'm in the self-improvement genre, and so all the cold plungy, bro content. I'm just like, part of me follows it because I should know what's going on in my somewhat adjacent peer group. But another part of me is just like, God, make it fucking stop.
Do you know
like,
what Tradwives are? Have you heard of that term?
I've heard the term. I a little bit, but go ahead. I know the audience has not.
Well, so Tradwives are like, it's kind of this return to the 1950s housewife. Like the lady stays at home and takes care of like 17 kids, and the guy goes and works. And it's very popular amongst a certain crowd online. And
ironically or genuinely?
Genuinely.
Okay.
Yeah. But like in these people will do this lifestyle and they'll post it all to social media. So like one example is Ballerina Farm. She has like a $20,000 stove. And everyone's like, oh my God, she's living so authentically. But they have like, a bunch of help. They have a bunch of servants that are actually running the farm. And it kind of reminds me of what you were saying about the cold plunge and kind of like that hustle bro mentality is people are doing that for clicks. Like they're doing that sort of thing for engagement. Like people, women fought kind of hard to not have to be Tradwives. And now we're returning to that, but we're only returning to that because it's monetizable. We're only returning to that because you can sort of paint this story and this narrative around it. And I think hustle bro culture is really similar where it's like, I'm going to like that Brian Johnson guy. It's very similar where it's like, I can make money off being the most extreme end of the distribution. And so that's what I'll do. And it's impossible to avoid that content because algorithm rewards it because it is so extreme and because it is so reactive and people want to respond to it.
And so what does someone like, how does someone who is bombarded with that content, like what are their options to stay sane?
So there's this other article, and I'm going to forget this guy's name, but it was so good. And he was talking about how teens are experiencing social media. And it's like, okay, is the answer to keep the teens off social media. And the only way that would work is if all the teens got off social media, because if you're a teen and all your friends have social media, you feel just as bad as they do, like, cause you're left out. So like, there's this fear of missing out that happens when you're not using social media too. So you're just as down. Of course, I think you're a little bit happier, but you're still down a little bit, especially if you're a teen. And so I think that's the big question is like, well, is it screen limits? Like, do you use it for an hour a day? Do you not engage? Do you, only tune into your friends' feeds? You use it for what it was originally meant to be used for, which is like connecting with people. And I think that's the big question is like, how do we actually integrate this into our lives? Because right now, for a lot of people, it's taking over. And they're totally missing out on a lot of real world experiences. And this is a small segment of the population. Like there's a bunch of normal people who are out there just posting and then maybe checking it a couple times a week. But then there's the chronically online group, which a lot of people are starting to fall into. Yeah.
I think about that because we had this with Roblox with our daughter. And I was just kind of it was more like I was fighting the fight to know that I could kind of win the fight. Because I think Roblox is pretty harmless, but it got to the point where everyone in the class had Roblox except my daughter.
Yeah.
And so the FOMO was not even about Roblox, it was just being left out. And my wife and I talk about, we're going to do the same with phones, but the same thing's going to play out. It's like, it's going to be just as painful to be the one, the odd kid out. So I don't look forward. Do you remember how old you were when you got your phone?
I was old. I was way older than everybody else. I think I was 14. So still pretty young. And and this was also a lot, everything's gotten more compressed. Like they're second graders with iPhones now. Yeah. This was more 12 years ago is when I got my first phone. And so like that was I'm trying to do math. Is it 2012? Is that right? Is that 2012 was 12 years ago?
12 years ago, yep.
Yeah, so it was 2012. So like phones were very popular. Some people, the big thing for me was like I had a flip phone and everybody else had the iPhone. And that was hard, right? Because of course there's social signaling that comes. And now everybody just has an iPhone. It doesn't matter. But like there's social signaling that comes with these things. But you're right, like they are getting them younger and younger. And I don't have kids, so I can't even relate to like, it's probably easy to plop them in front of an iPad and just be like, okay, and like go like hang out. And I get that. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
What about kind of the role of consumerism in it all, right? And we talked about the feed just being this like giant engine of like buy this, whether it's influencers or corporations or Michael Cera, just like buy.
Yeah.
And and this is like somewhat of a tangent, but I feel like you'd be like the perfect person to talk about this with. I was at my gym the other day, and my friend has these kind of like fake CrossFit sneakers. Like they've been like they rip off, Alibaba rips off, the Reebok version, and they're $40, and he loves them, and they're just as good. And so he has these CrossFit shoes, but they're white and they're dirty, but they're perfect, but they're just, and he wants to get them clean. So he goes to look for a cleaner, like a shoe cleaner, like he wants to pay someone to clean his shoes, basically, and he can only find someone that will charge $40 for them. And so he's like, fuck. He's like, I could push a button and a brand new clean pair will show up. Or I can like go through all this labor, do the right thing, which is not like throw another pair of perfectly good shoes into a landfill and spend. And I feel like people have some version of that dilemma, like all the number of random things I buy from Amazon that are just like, I could just fix this thing, but it's just so much easier to push this button.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's so much baked into that, but I wonder if it's like what that kind of, what you read from that situation and what it exemplifies to you.
So there's a word for that. It's the replacement economy rather than the repair economy. So like part of the issue is labor has gotten quite expensive for these things that like we would like to be a lot cheaper. And of course, there's a whole conversation to be having about like how expensive labor should be and like how we value people, etc. But the problem is it has become much more cheap to simply just buy a new thing and buy something that is maybe like not as high quality, but you can just replace it. So I do that too. Like it's just like, I'll just get a new one rather than trying to replace it. And so, yeah, that's a big thing that a lot of people do because it is cheaper most of the time. And like it ties back into the concept of planned obsolescence too. Is like washers and dryers. People are like, it's so much money to fix it. I'll just get a new one. So that's kind of the idea with the replacement economy is that people are just going to replace rather than repair.
And that in part that is like an engine of consumption, like it's an engine of GDP growth, right? And so
consumer spending is 70% of GDP. So it's good that people are out there spending. But I think it's an example of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. And that's just the way that the economy grows. I get a lot of criticism for saying things like that. Like, this is just the way that it is. But that's true, is like, this is just the way that the economy is. And there's a lot of room to like rethink that. Like a lot of the GDP growth that we experienced in the most recent print was from manufacturing spending from the government. So the government investing in certain projects has helped grow the economy. And I think that there's more like lasting things like that could be
like chip
better.
makers, that kind of, or just
exactly like the CHIPS Act. Yep.
Got it. Why do people why do they criticize you for saying that's just the way it is?
Because they're like, oh, you're not recognizing the problems with it. Like, you should just be addressing how bad it is. And I think like that's true. Like, that's valid. But I think there's also an element of accepting how the system works and understanding how the system works. And that's when you can start to evoke change. Like if you're just bemoaning the current state of affairs, that's not very useful to anybody. And so like a lot of times I'll just say like, this is how it is. And we can make it better, but like we have to accept the current state of affairs before we begin to proceed, right? And you have to understand like why it's bad, right? Rather than just being like it's bad.
Do you think that what are the lowest hanging? And this is we're leaving my domain of expertise, so I'll just plant that as a fair warning. But like in terms of kind of the lowest, the lowest hanging fruit in terms of like economic policy, what do you think? Do you have a thought or opinion or ideas of what that is?
I mean, social safety net. I think that would do a lot of really good stuff. Right now there's a bunch of layoffs happening, specifically in middle management tech, and I think there has to be like some sort of retraining program for those people. There's this New York Times article that was talking about how the loneliness crisis isn't real, which I don't agree with that premise. But they were saying that part of the reason that people feel so bummed and like sad and angry is because they feel left behind. And so I think the lowest hanging fruit in terms of economic policy and rebuilding trust, which I think is the most important thing to focus on from a policy level, is establishing a more direct connection to people and letting them know that the government is there and listening and like is here to provide support just in case things go sour. Because right now that's not how a lot of people feel at all, because that's not true. Like there isn't that net at all. So
and is that net obviously the obvious categories like unemployment benefits and healthcare, but you also retraining is one. Any other components in that?
I think the student loan debt situation should have been figured out a little bit differently. I think things like that are important. I'm a big fan of establishing baby bonds. Like if you look at one of my favorite
Remind
charts,
me how those work?
Yeah. So let me talk about this chart and then I'll talk about the baby bonds. So one of my favorite charts is from the Federal Reserve, and it's breakdown of wealth by income groups. So like the bottom 50%, all of their wealth comes from a house. And so normally when you think about building wealth in the United States, you even said it, you're like, well, we'll get the kids a house. Because we assume that that's going to go up in value over time, because usually it does. But if you look at the top 10%, most of their wealth is in business ownership and equity, right? Like it's in stocks and it's in having a part of the business that they work for. And so I think we can look at that graph and like clearly see where some of the wealth inequality is coming from, is that these people don't have ownership in the businesses they work for, and they also don't know how to invest in the stock market. And so baby bond is essentially like assigning a bond to a baby, like giving, investing via that baby some money into the bond market, and then that baby will own the bond will mature, the baby gets that money once the baby's like 30 or whatever. And so I think that sort of model would be good. It's just like setting people up right away with some sort of investment vehicle, because a lot of people aren't invested in the stock market. They should be, in my opinion. And a lot of people are not invested in bonds unless they have a 401k. And so I think if we want to think about wealth a little bit differently, we have to think about building wealth differently. Like part of the issue with the housing crisis is that we have all these people like not in my backyard who are like, listen, like if you're talking about building housing, like my house might go down in value. And there's studies showing that like if you do build housing, houses don't go down in value, right? Like there's a study out of New Jersey that shows that does not happen. But people think that it will, right? And you're essentially challenging their entire livelihood at that point. You're like, I'm going to make you worth nothing. And it's like, oh my gosh. So of course they're going to be angry. And so I think we have to reestablish, like, number one, housing should probably not be a speculative asset. And then number two, how do we establish people some sort of wealth vehicle right away? And investing in U.S. government debt is a great path forward. If the U.S. debt defaults on that debt, we have bigger issues at hand. So it's relatively safe, I think, as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that not a lot of people are invested in the stock market, which obviously shows the kind of distorted, the narrow sample size of people that I hang out with. And I think I remember reading a statistic that like 5% of households own 95% of U.S. stocks or something. I'm like, to me, when I saw that, I was like, well, that explains everything you need to know about like economic policy in the U.S. Right. All right. But I would have thought that with kind of the advent of Robinhood and like lower commission tradings and just like, like pretty buoyant markets over, I mean, I guess it depends what time period, but that younger folks are more are more receptive. Like when I was growing up, like you start to like you had to call a broker to buy shares, and so it was not even like a thing that you could even really entertain as an 18-year-old. Like, oh, I'm not gonna get a brokerage account with a physical human broker. But I guess my question is: are younger folks more afraid, like hesitant about equities, or it's like the adoption isn't there? I'm curious about the relationship between like long-term like boggleheads, and kind of Generation Z.
Yeah, no, I think people are receptive. A lot of people got in via GameStop, and I think that's part of the problem is people got in during this like very speculative time. They were like, why isn't my stock going up 5,000%? Hello.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just like a lot of long-term, like people are not thinking in the long term. So I'd say like people are definitely open and receptive to investing. It's just like, how do we get them to do it sustainably? How do we understand what ETFs are? How do we understand what vehicle is best for them? And that's tough, right? Because a lot of financial advisors, their whole business model is predicated on working with super rich people. That's how they make money. And it's really like super rich people need help, but like so do younger people. And so I think that's like kind of the thing is, it's never been easier, but it's also never been harder to get the proper information about what you should be doing. Because the incentive of a company like Robinhood, and this is not slander, it's just the business model, is for you to
volume
gamble.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So my last question for you is you've blazed this extremely unique trail, and it's just, as an outside now, I'm glad that I'm honored that I get to meet you. It's just like so freaking cool and unique and impactful. So just like kudos to you. Like the question, like, are young people okay? It's like, fuck yeah. It's like we have a perfect example, like on the other side of this podcast. But I suspect that you get asked often, I don't know, let's pick like someone graduating from college now for like career advice, like what should I do? What should I study? And what kind of job should I build an audience? Like what's the most common kind of question that you get from a 21-year-old, 22-year-old? And kind of what thoughtful answer do you give them?
So my little brother is actually trying to figure his stuff out right now. And he, his question is always like, how do I become successful? And that's like really tough to answer because there's so many layers to that question. Like, what does success look like to you? What are you comfortable with doing in order to achieve that success? Like, how much do you want to work? Like, is success like maybe work-life balance to you? And so for me, like when people ask me that question, it's kind of like, focus on what you really care about. Like I feel really lucky because I really love the Federal Reserve and really love economics and
words that have rarely been said.
Well, I just and I love like
and it shows.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. But like I just love talking about that. And so I think like I don't know if always working within your passion is the key, but like if you can find something that you truly care about and truly care about beyond the eye. Like there's this story of I think is it Johnny Cash on his deathbed? He was like telling this story, I think, on his deathbed. He might have not been dying, but he was telling the story about like how he went back to all of his old songs and removed the word I, and they just sounded so much better because he removed himself from the equation, right? And so I think that's like a big part of it too, is like, how can you do something that isn't necessarily selfless, because nothing is inherently a selfless act. Like there's always some sort of incentive for you in there, but how can you do something that is in the service of other people? Because I think that's ultimately where we get the most fulfillment. Like how can you tie together your passions and then tie that together with helping people? And so that's what I say. And it's always really abstract and people are always like, but what do I do next? And I'm always like, I don't know. Yeah. So that's my...
Yeah, no. And I feel very, very much of a kindred spirit with you in that regard. KYLA, this is just awesome. I could talk
Thanks.
to you for hours. I'm really glad. I'm so excited for our listeners to get to hear from you. Where is the best place for them to go check out all your wares?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Kyla Scan. I have a newsletter, kyla.substack.com. I have a book coming out that you can pre-order on Amazon or at penguinrandomhouse.com. But the book is titled In This Economy. It comes out May 28th.
Awesome. We'll put all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much. This was so awesome.
Thank you.